So George, Lee, a Sky original film starring Kate Winslet, directed by Ellen Kuras, who historically was a DOP, and she's directing this film. She worked with Kate Winslet on shooting Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And this is a story of photographer Lee Miller. And a story of Lee Miller's life has apparently been circulating for a long time, something like 20, 25 years. People have been trying to make an adaptation of Lee Miller's life. Lee Miller was a model in her youth and eventually became a photographer. This film documents her period of her life from the mid-1930s through to her involvement in World War II and afterwards. We start with Lee Miller in, it's France, isn't it, with her friends. Very sort of like casual and fun and bohemian. They sort of smoke and they have their tops off and they're having gorgeous sun-soaked picnics. But obviously the threat of Hitler and the rise of far-right extremism is very much there. They're watching the Pathé News projections, giving their takes on the war. And it's very much, there's sort of this moment where one of her friends says to her, "Oh, you really must come back to Paris with us. It's going, all of this is going to be great." And she says no, and that's obviously such a key life-changing decision. If Paris was completely destroyed and invaded as in part of the World War II. She actually ends up falling in love, going back to London, and takes photographs for Vogue magazine. And the editor of Vogue magazine is played by Andrea Riseborough. And she feels this call to go to World War II and photograph the war. And she does that with American photographer
Davy Sherman,
played by Andy Samberg, who's doing a real sort of acting departure of him. We haven't really seen him do anything like this, as far as I'm aware. And it follows her trying to get a place to photograph World War II. And obviously, as a woman, she is denied at many different instances for all the reasons that women were denied access to World War II. But nonetheless, through perseverance and pure attrition, she manages to get to the front lines. She's photographing the initial conflict in France, and then makes a decision to drive for a few months to the front lines of the war in Germany. And her photographs are some of the most famous depictions of World War II. She is one of the first people to have photographed the horrors of the Holocaust and to have got that media presented in Vogue. And this tells the story of her in World War II. It also stars Josh O'Connor, who plays... Well, I actually won't say who he plays. It also stars Josh O'Connor and Alexander Skarsgård and Marion Cotillard, Andrea Riseborough, who I said. Cotillard, thank you. And quite a big cast, actually, for a film like this. Yeah. And George, Lee, how did you get on with it?
Yeah, so we went to a screening of this and we knew that you were going to be speaking to the director. I think the story is really interesting and really, really incredible. Like, her life just sounds brilliant. I was slightly sad from my perspective to find that I found it particularly pedestrian, prosaic, straightforward, very cliched biopic, which is a real shame because I love Kate Winslet and I love the cast and I really am interested in this story, but it never really actually elevates itself more than just your very standard kind of half-baked biopic. But there is some interesting stuff happening. So like I say, Kate Winslet is great, fully committed, as good as everything.
Always, as she always has been.
I think, and the cast in general are wonderful. There are some slightly bizarre things with the cast. Marion Cotillard is in a tiny little role, but she's just there. There's this very bizarre casting decision to cast Alexander Skarsgård as a Brit, which I found very distracting, very, very distracting, because he's Alexander Skarsgård and does not have a British accent. He's just got his own accent. You also have this sort of strange thing where Lee Miller was American and Kate Winslet is playing her, which is not a problem. Actors have done that all the time. But there is this moment where we're seeing Kate Winslet in London, which of course we're used to seeing. And Kate Winslet goes, "Of course, I'm American. I can do this." And I'm like, yes. And I think... it might sound pedantic to pull out details like that, but I think it's an example of because the film wasn't working for me and other elements, I was more drawn to this. I think seeing Andy Samberg turn up in a different role is great.
It's really good in it, yeah.
But I just felt like there was lots of interesting ingredients that it kind of just walked through and showed me, but it didn't engage me in a way. And I thought, these are all wonderful ingredients and really interesting parts of the story. And there was honestly only one part of the film that I really kind of got interested in, was when the tide of the war is changing. And this is like 2/3 into the movie. Yeah. The tide of the war is changing. We're nearing the end. It's 1944, 45. And it's that moment where Lee Miller realizes that the war, something else is happening. That people are disappeared. She hears about people who have disappeared and not come back, and you get this perception of that. You know what the Holocaust was before. What the perception of the Holocaust was to those, you know, the Allied forces who weren't aware of it, who hadn't lived through it, and coming to discover it for themselves. That's quite interesting. But sadly, I did find it quite underwhelming and quite boring.
That was my favourite part too, and I think it's the most interesting concept because I think we forget that the Holocaust, the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed after the war, and it took a long time for people to want to talk about it, and for the media to actually itself get published. And I think we take for granted for media in war today is what it's a part of the whole thing live as it's happening, but back then you needed someone to see it, you needed to get the photos to where it needed to be, and there's this there's a really great conversation where they're trying to understand why people are going missing, they're sort of like Jews, gypsies, artists, communists, everyone who's got an idea different to them, we don't know where they're gone, everyone's looking for someone, and I think there is a bit of like media and photographic history about where those photos ended up going, and I think that's a very interesting part of it. But watching the film, it's sort of an exercise in realizing that you need to have a statement or a reason for making this film. Otherwise, I feel like I'm kind of scrolling through a Wikipedia page slightly, which is such a shame because I do think the story is brilliant, and some of the moments where photography is captured is definitely really difficult to see. But we made this comment as well because you and I both casual fans of photography. We almost felt like there could have been more made about the construction of the photos and lining them up, because it's only in the credits, if you stay for them, that the photos and the moments you've been seeing are going to be held up. And I almost thought, ironically, Civil War, which is a war photography film, did a better job of impacting you with the photograph and doing the still image and having it sit there and land. I was like, that actually worked better as a war photography film.
And actually, I almost also think that the bike riders had more to say about photography. Than not obviously war photography, but
which is based on a photography book.
It's interesting that those two films stand out more, and that was slightly my frustration as well, which is that you have a film about a very famous photographer, also directed by someone who was a DP, director of photography, and I was surprised at how uncharismatic and interesting visually the film was to look at. Look, I accept
it's tricky because
the time period was very brown and very boring, but I still don't think it was shot in a particularly engaging way. It actually looked very digital and very kind of flat and new, and I just was surprised. I'm like, that period you're talking about in the 1930s where she's with all of her friends, who, by the way, I only realised afterwards one of the characters is Pablo Picasso. Don't know if you picked up on that.
I didn't pick up on that at all.
What a wasted ingredient, right? What a wasted ingredient. And I'm like, that should have been really, like, you could have really livened that up. That's a real rich period of history.
Rolling with fiction a bit there.
Exactly. But no, I was actually quite disappointed at how kind of flat and staid it was. Like I said, just kind of trots through these ingredients. So it's like you have that Pablo Picasso not even mentioned or shown up. Then like, yes, she's back in London and Cecil Beaton's there. Oh, hi, Cecil Beaton. Yeah, okay. Again, Cecil Beaton, famous photographer in his own right. And then the stuff with Andrea Riseborough. And I just, I wish it gelled more. I wish it gave me more impact. And bizarrely, as you say, Civil War almost had more to say about.
And there's a moment at the end, which I won't. I think if you'll know this if you've seen it, where I think it tries to make a grander point and tie. It's almost, I'd say, arguably a twist. Where it tries to tie something together, and unfortunately, because the film hadn't really won me over, and this dynamic of an older Lee Miller talking about her life in the photographs that were taken, this moment at the end to try and tie it up to make it more profound just didn't land for me, and it felt very filmy. And that sort of consolidated my thoughts on the film.
I was like, in that moment at the end, I thought, if you're going to do that, I think you should have completely restructured and reframed the whole way of doing this film, and then actually the way into this story could have been through Josh O'Connor's character. You almost could have begun with Josh O'Connor's character, and then we could have got into the world of Lee Miller. But
definitely check out the photography. Yes. I guarantee you actually probably, if you watched or consumed World War II historical documentaries, you will have seen her work, because I recognised the photos but didn't know they were attributed to Lee Miller, and the film at the end does show you the photos that were taken. So there is always that, and I think you and I are always just going to enjoy dramatisations of World War II and the true stories that were told, but just not quite elevating itself for me, unfortunately.
No, sadly. I was actually quite surprised to see the film. We saw the film a few weeks ago, and then since then we've realised that it's had a red carpet premiere. And Kate Winslet's been on the One Show, and I've actually been slightly surprised at the scale they've put behind this film, because I thought it was so fairly average. But well intentioned, good talent there. Just wishing that the story was. That the film was as good as the story it told.
Yeah, it's like you're longing for a bit more artistic flair in that film, strangely.
Because they're about an artist.
It's artists making films about art in the most extreme of circumstances.
Yeah.
And even the moments when, which I know moments that really happen, she is running with her camera at her chest while bullets are flying around, grenades popping off. I don't actually feel that much in those scenes as I think I could have, which is slightly strange when I know this is a true story and I am talking about someone who actually would have done this.
Yeah.
But yeah, definitely, I think the life and story of Lee Miller is really interesting. And if you've seen the film, but if not, you can find out more about the photos and how they were found and how it eventually got printed and who was able to show the stories. And Lee Miller's thoughts on that are very interesting. Her identity as someone who was in front of the camera and then being behind it, being a woman. There's all great things there.
I also would have liked to have seen, I know because the real substance of her life and her career is her photography, but the fact that she was a Vogue model, and I would have loved to have seen the contrast in the glamour of that world, and then the reality of that time, particularly the sexism of reaching a certain age and then being aged out of being a model, and then what do you do then? Because there's this, it's like one line when she comes back to London and Cecil Beaton sort of says, we don't deal with has-been models, what are you doing here? And I'm like, that's actually quite an interesting point you could have drawn out there, but
but it wasn't necessarily burdening itself with being a Lee Miller biopic.
It's called Lee.
Yeah, it is called Lee.
It is,
we're picking up in the sort of mid-1930s and then basically ends first at the end of the war. So it's not worried about telling the whole
life.
thing.
No, I suppose.
Which I guess I wonder if it had been chopped around for ages. I bet there are loads of different versions of people trying to tell different parts of her life. But yeah, that's what you were going to say.
Well, I was just saying. Also, I'm not a big. This is nitpicking now. This isn't necessarily a big criticism. It's more just a side point. I'm never a big fan of movies that just have a name for a title, or just one calling it Lee. I'm like, it almost tells me about the film. That's not interesting enough about.
And the poster is a full comp of Kate Winslet's face, Lee written across. It's like this star, 3 letters, Lee. But as always, guys, if you've seen Lee and you want to let us know your thoughts, please send your thoughts in, your questions, your thoughts, your concerns, your reviews to hello@pulpkitchenpodcast.com. We would love to read them out on the show. If maybe you thought differently to us or you got something out of it that we didn't, as always, we would love to hear about it.